They call it the most transformative piece of legislation in the 20th century America. The law that built the modern middle class, the bridge to home ownership, the gateway to college degrees, the ladder into generational wealth. It was called the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. We now know it as the GI Bill. But here's the question no one asked loudly enough: who actually benefited? And who was legally included but structurally excluded? Tonight, we're telling that truth. In 1944, as World War II was nearing its end, Congress passed the GI Bill. It promised returning veterans low interest home loans, tuition assistance for college or vocational training, unemployment compensation, business loans. On paper, it applied to all veterans: Black, white, Latino, Asian. If you wore the uniform, you qualified. That's the myth. Here's what they don't teach: the GI Bill was administered locally. That meant banks decided who got loans, colleges decided who got admitted, real estate agents decided who could build. And America in 1944 was segregated legally, culturally, financially. After the war, white veterans flooded into new suburban developments like Levittown. Homes were affordable, mortgages were federally backed, equity began to grow. But many of those neighborhoods had racial covenants, whites only. Banks practiced redlining, a policy backed by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. Black veterans were denied loans, denied access, denied entry into the suburbs that would later multiply in value. So while white families built generational wealth through home equity, Black families were often confined to underfunded urban neighborhoods. That difference compounds. One home purchased in 1948 can fund college in 1975 and a business in 1995 and retirement in 2025. Multiply that across millions of families. That is how a racial wealth gap is manufactured. The GI Bill paid tuition, but where could Black veterans go? Historically, Black colleges and universities, HBCUs, were already underfunded and overcrowded. Many predominantly white institutions simply refused admission. Between 1947 and 1950, thousands of Black veterans were turned away from colleges in the South. Meanwhile, white veterans flooded campuses. Enrollment in higher education doubled. College degrees translated into higher lifetime earnings, professional careers, political power, corporate leadership. Access matters. The GI Bill also offered business loans, but approval required bank cooperation. Black entrepreneurs often face discrimination in lending. So, the program that launched construction firms, law practices, and family businesses for white veterans rarely did the same at scale for Black veterans. Again, not because the law said whites only, but because the system did. By 1950, nearly 8 million veterans had received education or training benefits. But in Mississippi, for example, one of the thousands of GI Bill mortgages issued in the early post war years, only a handful went to Black veterans. In some cities, fewer than 2% of GI Bill backed loans went to Black applicants. This is how inequality becomes invisible. because technically everyone qualified. Practically, everyone did not. Imagine this contradiction. You fight Hitler's racial ideology abroad, you survive war, you return home with medals, and you are told by a bank teller, no. You are told by a university registrar, no, not here. You are told by a real estate agent, this neighborhood isn't for you. What does that do to a nation's psyche? What does that do to generational momentum? When we talk about the racial wealth gap today, it did not begin in 2020. It did not begin in 1980. It did not begin in 1968. It was accelerated in 1944. The median white family today holds significantly more wealth than the median Black family. Home equity remains one of the largest drivers of that gap, and home ownership rates still reflect the structural exclusions of the GI Bill era. Policy is not neutral, policy echoes. And here's where it connects. Black POWs endured enemy camps. Black veterans endured Jim Crow. And when the war ended, many were locked out of the very benefits meant to reward their service. So the question isn't whether Black soldiers were patriotic. The question is whether America was. The GI Bill built the American middle class, but it built it unevenly. And until we tell that full story, we misunderstand wealth. We misunderstand power. We misunderstand history. Because when we say, my grandfather bought a house for 8,000 and now it's worth 600,000, we must also ask, whose grandfather wasn't allowed to buy? Black history is not about grievance. It's about clarity, and clarity is power.